Thank you, John, for inviting me. And thank you, Deborah, for your lovely introduction. Okay, I'd like to begin with a brief, to sort of contextualize. This is the Billboard chart for 1975. I was 12 years old. Position number 1, Captain and Tennille, Love Will Keep Us Together. Glenn Campbell, Rhinestone Cowboy. Elton John, Philadelphia Freedom. Freddie Fender, Before the Next Teardrop Falls. Frankie Valli, My Eyes Adored You. Earth, Wind and Fire, Shining Star. Neil Sedaka, Laughter in the Rain. Eagles, One of These Nights. John Denver, Thank God I'm a Country Boy. Okay, I know that Marcel Proust, moving on, dropped a cookie into a cup of tea and wound up coming up with 9 volumes. What I'm worried about is dropping a cookie into a cup of tea and winding up with Captain and Tennille. So this is an attempt to come to grips with it. I was born in 1963. That was a watershed year. The Beatles at that point had lit the fuse for popular music explosion in the United States. Based on what I've heard, this was the first time top-of-the-chart music was literally inescapable. Everyone was listening to it. You could hear it on street corners, dorm rooms, cars, restaurants. And I missed the golden era of music, but I turned 10 at the end of radio. But I had a taste of what it was like. Kids today may not understand. This was an era when you listened to a selected song list over and over again, regardless of whether you liked it or not. That was because of radio, a medium without earbuds, which amplified music, and particularly Billboard hits, for large numbers of people at the same time. And during this era in the mid-70s, selected songs and riffs were implanted in your brain several hours a day. Hopefully, but not always, this would translate into the buying of records, circular bits of plastic with grooves. These were not sold as artifacts of an era. They were actually played in what is called record players. They could also be propagated using boom boxes, large plastic boxes that could take up 2 or 3 seats at the rear of a bus. The brain itself was physical, located inside, not outside the skull. It was highly regarded, but not necessarily that smart. Its capacity was limited to 1 or 2 bytes of information, and this information was stored in what might be best described as a 45-minute cassette tape, infinitely repeatable. We'll refer to that as the interior tape loop. The early years of a child at that point were devoted to the recording of the tape loop. There were 2 phases. By the age of 10, the idea was to learn everything about mathematics and literature necessary to carry you through a middle-brow life. That might require about 15 minutes. The ages 10 to 12 involved the construction of the child as a consumer of popular culture. By the age 12 then, the brain, or if you will, a cassette, was pretty much completed, with several minutes set aside for, say, graduate school. Through adolescence, we learned to process that information with the goal of getting laid. Later on, it could be used, presumably, in the search for employment. Throughout life, it would be a resource for the engagement of conversation. We had parents, but they didn't teach us about sex, and you couldn't learn about it on the internet. Most of what we learned was from Donna Summer, Peter Frampton, or Gene Simmons. Specific explanations and definitions would come later, but those were the formative tools. We heard about sex, at least technically, but we didn't accept the salt easily. Artistic or creative activity in our adolescent years a little bit later was devoted to finding some way of getting peaches and herb out of our so-called tape loop. Musical groups like Flipper, Anthrax, Millions of Dead Cops, Black Flag, The Germs, Minor Threat were born of a concerted effort to Zamboni, I guess, Rod Stewart's "Do You Think I'm Sexy?" from our cerebral ice skating rink. In retrospect, we had no idea what we were up against. At my advanced age, I can't whistle anything by Flipper, but I can sing Rhinestone Cowboy by Glenn Campbell. But we're at peace with that. The next several decades will change nothing. As they get married, the next generation will have to deal with the spectacle of grandparents freed from the bonds of sobriety, doing a booty chain till she's a brick house. We don't expect respect, just understanding. We don't necessarily like these songs. We never asked to listen to them in the first place, but this is who we are, no matter how hard we tried to resist it. And when other elements of our brain go, shake your groove thing, will still be encoded. And it's not who our children are either. They will grow up having had the ability to choose from a limitless assortment, their only challenge being to file it in the correct genre. Industrial death metal, Teutonic thrash metal, screamo, Christian Nintendo core, et alia. These are the Legos of their cultural persona, developed with sophistication and architectural vision, which we never had. But we had these 10 or 12 songs steamrolled in our brains, independent of our choice. It's a never-ending series of songs and jingles which surface at momentous and not so momentous moments in our life. But I can handle it. I grew up in the mid to late 70s in an era of relative prosperity, without wars or serious recessions. But we did grow up having to listen to the Billboard charts from 1975 through 1978. The tape loop is there whether I want it or not. That's fine, I'm not in denial. But when I fill out my will and I think about related things, how it all ends, I guess, I realize I don't want to move into the next world, if there is a next world, singing certain songs to myself. I mean that if I think of my life as a movie, I don't want Feelings by Morris Albert to be sung during the credits. So I'm adding a category to my will. 10 songs not to play anywhere near me if I'm on life support. I want to clarify, these aren't my favorite songs. They're not the songs I most hate. But as someone who was 10 in 1973, I can guarantee you that if I'm lying strapped to a bed and on life support, when all mental facilities have ground to a halt, my brain will automatically repeat these songs to itself over and over again until I breathe my last breath. So here's a list of songs not to play anywhere near me. Now the first one, Pachelbel's Canon. I feel it's useful to begin here. This late 17th century German Baroque composer is in some ways the genius behind late 70s pop. The canon was definitely part of my 5th and 6th grade years. It was drilled into our heads. It enjoyed a radio renaissance in my childhood. There was a disco version of it. It gained peak popularity in 1980 with the film Ordinary People. So for some of us, it's winsome, bittersweet tingle, muffled in layers of harmony, has become a soundtrack for dissolving marriages. Number 2, Play That Funky Music, White Boy, by Wild Cherry. Did Wild Cherry exist? Was it even a person? I don't know. The lyrics, prosaic, but amazingly prescient, say it all. Lay down the groove and play that funky music till you die. Number 3, That's the Way I Like It, Casey and the Sunshine Band. I've spent many years memorizing poetry, individual poems that I feel will remain in my head, or at least I hope will, whenever all else fails. But something strange happens. Whenever I do, Casey enters it. Let me give you an example from William Shakespeare. Not from the stars do I my judgment pluck. I do not receive my knowledge or make my decisions by the stars. And yet methinks I have astronomy. Though I have enough training in astrology to do so, but not to tell of good or evil luck, I cannot predict good luck or bad, of plagues, of dearths, or season's quality, or plagues, or famine, or the weather. Nor can I fortune to brief minutes tell. nor can I say what will happen at every given moment in our daily lives. When you take me by the hand, tell me I'm your loving man. When you give me all your love, and do it, babe, the very best you can, that's the way, I like it, Number 4, You Make Loving Fun by Fleetwood Mac. Now, I know, you like it, they're a great group, you're driving in your car and you can find it anywhere on the radio, even today, so you roll your eyes. What's the big deal, you ask? I hear it all the time. Bill Clinton used it at his campaign song. No, I say, you don't know what it was like back when I was 10. Rumors was recorded in 1976. I was 13 by then. That was when I had my first root canal. They played it in dentist's office. Fleetwood Mac was everywhere. This was a genius of post-flower power totalitarian brainwashing, and we were white mice, and we were children. Number 5, Do You Feel Like I Do by Peter Frampton. This version was on an album called Frampton Comes Alive, which spent about 200 weeks on the Billboard charts during my formative years. It featured a talk box in which the lyrics were routed through the electronic guitar. That was considered at the point a pinnacle of music technology, but it had a permanent effect on my frontal lobe. Even today, I'm at a lecture or even a job interview, and I start to hear people speaking to me as if they're being played through a talk box, lip-synced by Frampton himself, with his signature open shirt, skinny chest bare. Number 6, More Than a Feeling by Boston. I just want to show you something. I'm at a dance for 13-year-olds at my Catholic high school. The basketball court is dark. There's a small crowd of young boys hovering close to one another for pseudo-bro comfort. Across the dark court is a small cabal of girls from Visitation Prep, the only Catholic girls' school in the city that will talk to us. They're giggling at us as we start to gather courage. Then someone, a DJ from hell, or maybe a priest from hell, puts on More Than a Feeling by Boston. It starts off with strumming. There's an alto wail and a harmonic shriek from the guitar before the huge, lumbering, multi-layered guitar riff takes over. And we're supposed to dance with it? We stare hopelessly across the abyss as this layered guitar floods the entire black hole that was our social life. Number 7, Sailing by Christopher Cross. I don't want to mention it. I don't even know who Chris Cross is. I thought I'd forgotten about him, about his album cover. I just don't want to talk about it. But it's too late. Electric Light Orchestra, Evil Woman. I would find myself in record stores staring at the strange album cover with its huge signature spaceship. Were these actual people? Or androids with beards and mustaches and large crotches and open shirts sent from a distant planet? Number 9, I'm Sailing Away by Styx. Whenever I go to, say, a concert and I hear a piano solo, the Styx rule kicks in. Anything quiet is a prelude to something really loud. I expect the colored spotlights to turn on, a wail of Marshall stacks to appear, with 3 or 4 bearded guitarists stepping forward with their axes, starting the power chords. And number 10, finally, Carry On My Wayward Son by Kansas. I want to end with Kansas because it occupies a special place in my mind and has done so since 1975 when they hit the big time. Now, there is a state of semi-consciousness which often occurs at the tail end of dreams. Spatially, it can be compared to a minimum security prison. Imagine a deep bog, a marsh that sucks your feet to the knees. There's a wall, and outside the wall there's real life. You pull yourself toward that wall, emerge from the bog, start to climb toward the light. But with each foot conquered, a pound is added to your weight. The closer you move toward the light, the heavier you become. You reach the top of the walls, gripping it with your fingers, but you can't lift yourself over the edge. You slip and fall back into the thick, warm mud of semi-consciousness. You are back in the zone between life and death. You hear music thickly layered, densely crafted, with layers of harmony, powered by vague sentiments, mostly developed along the theme of the eternal wanderer, and you listen without being spoken to. You are exhausted without having spent serious effort. Any impulse to act is overwhelmed by the futility of action. You are at the dark, flat center of the American consciousness. You are in a zone of uneasy sleep, and that is the in-between land. That is Kansas. The sirens of semi-consciousness beckon and taunt. Carry on, my wayward son. There will be peace when you are done. Now, I've left out some names, I know that. I also have nothing but respect for the bands themselves. They exist in the world between the living and the dead. They created music you could listen to and not listen to at the same time. They were kings of this in-between land where we spend most of our lives. I suppose the most obvious question at this point, then, is what do you want to hear? And I guess, although it's not hard to say, or it is hard to say, I'd want something that wouldn't necessarily start amoeba strip of Starland vocal band's Afternoon Delight. But more specifically, I would probably want music piped in. Easily recognizable, that would send me to the underworld or the above world, that would sing of two worlds, the living and the dead, and nothing in between. They could play 433 by John Cage. The piano rests, and one listens to the world around one, appreciates each time for the first time that music is everything and everywhere. And even as we fade out of consciousness, as our term expires, the song continues, the song we've been listening to since childhood, in good times and bad, that the world, the universe has been singing to us, and that we didn't even know we were listening to until our last moments. But as an argument for returning to the land of the living, I might listen to another song. This one written in memory of a young Australian poet who died in tragic circumstances just as his own career was beginning to peak. He'd gone on and off life support, had been given up for dead, but the song itself seems to indicate that life goes on, that there is something about you that will crawl out of any grave they put you in. Here goes. I've been gone too long. I'm glad to be back. Yes, I am let loose from the noose that's kept me hanging about. I keep looking at the sky because it's getting me high. Forget the hearse because I'll never die. I've got 9 eyes, 9 lives, cat's eyes. I'm using every one of them, and I'm running wild. I'm back in black.